Hey everyone, so we're going to pick up the conversation of our individual constraint, structural growth and development over time, and try to tie that in a little bit to our overall motor development over the course of a lifespan. It's unfortunate, as you might have picked up through some of the embryonic and fetal development chats, that there's just so much detail that we potentially could get into. But unfortunately, in order to cover an entire lifespan, what we'll look at primarily is trends and kind of like patterns for specific systems over the span of a lifetime for people. And to do so, we can kind of dive into some details for some aspects, but again, we need to kind of stay a little bit zoomed out to a certain degree. So I will endeavor to do that as best I can for you. But obviously, it's like very interesting stuff. So yeah, we'll kind of press forth with that. So our first starting point will be to kind of explore and discuss overall growth and maturation kind of patterns, and then we'll dive into a little bit more about the development of each of the nervous, endocrine, skeletal, and muscular systems, and then how those kind of interact. Again, we're going to try to, for the most part, view each system individually. Obviously, there's a lot of interplay throughout the body. It's an entire holistic system, but unfortunately, we'll leave that for your anatomy and physiology courses to kind of tie in together. We'll try to look at these, again, over the course of a lifespan. And fortunately, we get to come back to these topics as we kind of progress through other aspects of the course. So yeah, let's not wait any longer and get going here. So one of the first questions I generally like asking and posing to the class when we're in person is asking this kind of question about three potential clients, if you're working as like a coach or a kinesiologist or someone that want to come in and each want to start to run a marathon. Okay, and the question is like, do you think it's safe? Do you think it's good for these individuals to do? Would you recommend it? And you'll definitely get questions like this if you're ever in that part of the industry. And the general answers come back, yes. Would I want an 8-year-old running a marathon? No. How about someone who's 18? Sure, of course. They're physiologically at the peak of their capacity. What about someone who's 80? No, probably not. Okay, and that's, again, just generally the answers that I get. And I like to kind of use this and pull up the point that there has been the youngest, I think, person to do a full marathon was a young boy who's about 8 or something like that. Again, quite young. I don't think the context around that situation was very good. Again, probably not the best idea for like a sociological or like psychological kind of aspect in that particular instance. But again, physiologically, there is a capacity to do so. 18-year-olds, yes, physiologically speaking, mentally, all that sort of stuff, generally okay. And then, last but not least, we get to our 80-year-old, and people are, oh, no, not at all. And sure enough, we've had like 100-year-olds. I think this gentleman, as far as I know, Fahuja, I might be pronouncing that wrong, Singh. It's a guy from Toronto, or was, I'm not sure if he's still with us, but was 100 years old, completed a marathon, ran with a group called Sikhs in the City, which I absolutely love. I think that's a great play on words and really fun. And yeah, I just think it's a really good point to kind of emphasize and highlight that right out of the gate here. I want to highlight that lifestyle choices and how we continue or not continue to use our bodies throughout our lifespan have a very significant impact on our capacity as we age. So already, hopefully, that's changing some people's paradigms or their perspectives on things as far as what we are capable of physiologically over our lifespan. Not everything is just meant to decrease and have a lack of capacity for us. I think the last point I'll make about that is if you look at the world's Masters Championships and in the older categories such as 80, 90, 90-year-olds, etc., a lot of those individuals that are competing at like a world level in these sports for their age groups, most of them didn't start doing sport until 10 years prior-ish, you know? So I think it's really impressive for those individuals who, again, hadn't ever really been physically active, but decided to start doing a physical activity and then were able to take it that far, especially at that point in their lifespan. So that's great. But speaking about physiological growth, what sort of trends can we see over the lifespan? So kind of like a standard percentile growth chart that we might see. We have two here. On the left we have stature, and on the right we have weight. And again, these are trends over a lifetime. When we're talking about percentiles, we're talking about percentage of the population that generally fall into these kind of trends or averages, if you will. And just to kind of highlight the point, the blue line, which hopefully you can kind of make out, which is right in the middle of both of these graphs, that represents the 50th percentile. So, you know, anything kind of like above that would be the people in the top 50% of, say, height or weight. And then similarly, vice versa, on the bottom half would be, you know, between 50 and, 1% or the first kind of percentile would be in the bottom half average heights. And I think there's two really important things to take home from this one and to really kind of understand is one would be the general pattern or curvatures that we notice with these both charts actually. And I think it's a little bit easier to see on our weight graph. So we'll look at that first, and then we'll turn back to the height and see how that works there. I'm sure you can see my mouse pointer, but I'm going to get something a little bit more obvious here. So if we're looking at our weight graphs over time, and let's just stick with the 50th percentile for now, we notice that we see a sharp uptick here, kind of like shortly after birth. So a very close to, I'm not going to say vertical, but very high slope line that kind of occurs here. We have a little bit of a plateau-ish, kind of between the ages of, let's say, 3 to 8-ish. And then after that, again, we have more upward slope till about the age of what looks like 15 on this graph, and then a little bit of a plateau. And if we were to continue on with this graph, I think for weight, you'd kind of notice this general softening or plateauing, maybe a little bit of an upward trend until about the age of 60, let's say, and then a bit of a downward trend from there. But why is that? The question is why. Okay. Again, always a good question when you're trying to figure out stuff and learn things. Always ask why. Why is that a thing? I've heard some information. Why is that the fact, right? So what explains this is, again, we're growing and gaining a lot of mass early on in life, right? And that kind of coincides with this height, right? It makes sense. If you're growing taller, you're also growing out, and so your mass, your weight will increase over time. Then we don't have as much growth. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's maybe the velocity at which we grow, so the rate, tends to decrease a little bit before we get our other growth spurt. And so if we think about that, that coincides with like being an infant and a child, you know, we have some growth kind of periods and our mass is coming up, but the big kind of secondary spike right after we're born is when we hit puberty, right? So again, when we're kind of at the ages between, let's say, well, nowadays I think the average is anywhere from 12 to about 16 or 17. You know, the rates of puberty initiating has been younger. That's kind of been a trend that we've noticed over the past few decades. Yeah, and so we'll kind of see that kind of upward growth of both height and mass kind of at that point in time, okay? Yeah, so that's the first part. The second part that's really important, oh, sorry, maybe I'll just step back 1 second. So what we call this kind of like curve, and then a plateau, and then a upward trend, and then another plateau. So we kind of have this double plateau, sort of curvy shape to the lines that we see on the graph. That's called a sigmoidal curve. Okay, a linear line or pattern be like a straight line. We could have asymptotes or like parabolic shapes, which would essentially go up to a certain point and then plateau, or vice versa, like drop down to a certain point and plateau and get very, very close, but just essentially a straight line after that point in time. But here we have two curves and two kind of linear sections, so sigmoidal. All right, the other important thing, when we're looking at stature and weight, is the fact that most people, whether, let's say if you're in the 90th or the 10th percentile, you will trend and stay within that percentile over your growth lifespan. Okay, so what does that look like? So again, if you're we'll follow this height, and again, all the lines are kind of close together here, but we're at the 90th, we're always going to maintain pretty close to that 90th percentile throughout our entire lifespan. Until we reach adulthood, we don't have any more linear growth in height, we stay there, right? Very similarly, if we're in the bottom 10th percentile of height, let's say, we're going to stay roughly in the bottom 10th percentile throughout. And so that's why it's really interesting after we're first born and we have like our height and weight measured. Again, generally speaking, we stay relatively close to that percentile our whole life. Now, the things that will affect this tend to be nutrition. That's one of the more common things. And and so, for example, if a newborn is underweight, definitely one of the big things for new parents and obviously the infant is to try to get them to eat more to ensure that they're getting up to their kind of like height and weight max for that particular age group relative to where they're at. And sure enough, you can make up for that time. Again, I mentioned this a little bit at the end of the last lecture, but in case you missed that, for example, at any point in time really during development, if you kind of drop down below height, and again, there's some caveats to that, but generally speaking, if you have a short period of undernourishment as far as energy requirements, you can usually eat and make up and get the nutrients you need at a slightly later date and be able to make up for that lost time. Now, of course, there's critical periods for certain things, and it's not like a perfect kind of trade-off that you can always make back, but there is a good capacity to be able to do that. Okay, and so that again requires for height and weight. All right, and again, just to kind of note the curves, just to explain this graph. Again, it's like anytime you see that sharp upward kind of curve, like especially here, again, we're talking about just kind of like just pre-puberty where we hit that max velocity. Okay. Good. So yes, we've kind of covered these general trends, especially infancy, toddlerhood, and puberty. Again, we'll come back to this shortly near the end, and you'll see kind of the plateau and slight decrease later in life. But just to talk about puberty, because that is one of the most profound times in our life where we grow in height and weight. I think the main thing here to kind of highlight that I haven't spoken about on the previous chart is just the difference again between our chronological age and our physiological maturation. So for example, even though our chronological age might be 13, let's say, for some individuals that doesn't necessarily mean you've entered puberty quite yet. So again, our maturation, physiological maturation, the physiological age of our cells might be different relative to our chronological age. Right? And again, to speak about women's first menstrual cycles or menarche, I think again, there's been a bit of a trend over the years that it's been getting early and earlier. I don't think there's any solid research yet. I could be wrong. I haven't checked the literature too recently on it, but there's no set explanation as to why that's happening. There's been lots of speculation, I think, about environmental influences. We'll have to wait for a little bit more research to give a good conclusion as to why that is occurring over the past few decades. Right? But one thing that we can look at in and around the time of menarche is this idea, for men or boys becoming men, is just before puberty hits. is this idea of a peak height velocity in growth. Okay, so again, if we're talking about height gain, we kind of notice this period of time, and it looks a little funny on this graph, and it's always good to kind of get your orientation on every graph. Didn't explain the other one, but here we have height in centimeters per year. So again, anytime you have something over a time frame, whether it's per seconds, months, years, whatever, you're talking about a rate at which something happens. And then we have our years over time kind of here. And so again, we can see in childhood, the rate, although it's like fairly high, higher than we would experience in puberty when we're around the years of 2 to, let's say, 3 years old. It's quite high, but it drops down steadily over childhood. So that still means we're growing with height at a relatively high rate, not the same as when we're, let's say, under 3 years of age. Again, not quite the same rate or speed, if we will, of height growth as when we're in puberty. So those two periods are a lot higher. But again, once we hit puberty, which girls hit a lot sooner than boys on average, you get your peak height velocity growth, and then on average by the age of 12, 13 years old, that starts to trail off, and by the age of 15, 16, women have hit their kind of peak height as far as how much growth they get per year, whereas boys or men kind of end closer to 17, 18 years old on average again. Now, one of the interesting things to kind of note as far as weight is that after we hit peak height velocity, we start to hit peak weight as well. As far as that following suit, so our peak weight velocity, so the rate at which we put on weight, is highest after we hit our height. So there's kind of this old adage or saying, you grow up and then fill out. It's very much true, supported by the data. So again, we kind of find this peak time for women, let's say around 12, men around 13 and a half, 14, and they have an extended, slightly longer and higher peak in their height velocity rate. So if you kind of think about this, if there's a longer period with a higher growth rate, that's one of the explanations as to why men typically are taller than women. And the other part of that too is we kind of have, men typically have, with that height, extra mass. So even their total mass is a bit more than women typically on average. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of key. Yeah, that's a big thing. So proportionally, as far as directionality and what limbs and torsos are kind of like growing when, one of the interesting things is it actually occurs in opposition to what we spoke about before prenatally, and then how our motor skills kind of develop. I know this kind of like looks really strange, and the reason for it is, for example, this infant is kind of proportionally or height-wise made the same height as an adult here in this graph, but the idea is to show proportionately how much of a newborn's head is relative to its entire body size. And again, just to think of this in a motor development sense, if you have an individual constraint, and that constraint happens to be your head being 1/3 the size of your body, and now think about trying to move around. Well, heads are very heavy relative to our bodies, and so if you have this head and like poor neck control, and it's just kind of like all over the place, it's going to be really hard to balance and do things like walk, for example. So I think just some appreciation to infants, and one, just trying to figure out how to walk, let alone having to deal with this like oversized weight pulling their center of gravity off of outside of their base of support is pretty challenging, to say the least. So again, that's just kind of one particular proportion to keep in mind for sure. The other part that I was mentioning before that works in opposition to what we covered previously is the fact that usually during adolescence you'll see things like hands and feet grow first, and then arms and legs, and then the torso. So again, that kind of happens in opposition to how we grow fetally, right? Which is that proximal distal, caudal, cephalo, right? So from head to tail, midline out to our periphery as far as growth. So it kind of flips that on end. Yeah, and so I usually ask this question to kind of spur on a bit of extra thinking. You can pause the video now if you want to do this yourself. I can also just give the answer, which I'm going to do now. So the idea is if you are practically coaching, let's say like a middle school team, you're kind of tracking anthropomorphic data, or you're like measuring the height and let's say shoe size or foot size of students as they're training for the team. If you have a bunch of students that happen to have like larger shoe size all of a sudden, and you can expect a growth spurt shortly thereafter or for the season after. So again, the kind of question that I pose as well that has a sociological side of that is, what do you do for these players, right, who do and don't have larger kind of growth spurts coming up for them? And kind of a range of answers and considerations to have would be, okay, so the players that are getting bigger for a very contact-based sport like lacrosse, obviously, like, they're probably going to progress and be very strong players in the following seasons, potentially. But what about the players that don't? Well, sport, is a really good social aspect. It's good to have general physical literacy throughout a lifespan, and keeping kids engaged in sport has like really great payoff down the road. So I guess it all comes down to how competitive the team is set to be, and hopefully there's another team in place for players to play on if they're not able to be on a very competitive team. So yes, and sometimes late developers end up being superb players. So okay, so I mentioned earlier that we lose height as we get older, and sure enough, a lot of that, our linear height, as it's called, so like from foot to bottom, comes from a loss or compression within the spine. So between our vertebrae, we have these little cushions, and they're kind of made up of like collagen and they're intervertebral discs essentially. So they're meant to bear a lot of weight. Over time, they kind of like degrade and lose some of their elasticity or cushioning, and as well as just the weight of gravity over time on our bones, how we sit with our posture, etc. All of that starts changing and compressing our vertebrae. And so what tends to happen is, and again, this is a case of osteoporosis that you might see as far as someone's posture over time, assuming that someone's bone health isn't optimum. Just to go back to osteoporosis is a weakening of bones that become more porous. So there's lots of little holes in bone typically, and again, depends whether you're talking about compact bone or spongy bone, but there's lots of holes in bone. And so what happens is you get larger and larger holes or pores within osteoporotic bone, which leads to breaks a lot easier, and or compression, as we can see demonstrated by our skeleton here on the right, our armless skeleton. So again, generally height is done in the 20s. You can have some increases till 40s, but typically you see a leveling off and plateauing. And again, we can look at a similar trend here on a chart in a second with our weight. Okay, so again, typically what we have here, so here's our height graph here. Again, kind of plateauing throughout life, but again, about 60 onward, we see a decrease. And again, just average heights for men and women here, but they parallel each other over the lifespan. And then here with body weight, we kind of see a similar trend, and then a decrease shortly between 60 and 70, more so as you get to older age. Now, even though obesity and weight gain is a bit of an issue throughout the lifespan for many, in let's say Western developed nations, we can see that it's troughed off towards the end, and usually that's because of muscle mass loss, which is a real issue, and we can we'll chat about that more when we get to the muscular system for sure. So again, here's our trends, kind of plateaus or upward, stabilizes, and then decreases over time. Okay, great. Here's a laundry list of learning objectives. You can pause and come back to here. And that is it for our overall growth and weight trends. Next up, we're going to talk about each individual system and how that develops over a lifespan, and how that looks as we get into old age. Catch you then.